Hello everyone, it's Ruby here, bringing you guys another Percy Jackson video. I was debating about who we would talk about next, because previously we talked about Annabeth, and now we're trying to figure out, okay, where do I go from here? I touched on basically my favorite character of the book, and I think it's fitting to talk about the character who used to be one of my least favorite characters, but grew into... I think over time I realized how important this character is. And that character is Rachel Elizabeth Dare, also known as Red. And also, in case you didn't know, any fan art that I use in my videos, I will always leave a credit down in the description. So I'll either use the artist's name or I'll link the actual piece. So there's all fan art is always credited, just so that you're aware. And if you like videos like this, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and also comment down below what else you want to see that is Percy Jackson related. I also stream games and do a lot of fun things on this channel. This channel is kind of just whatever I want to do. I don't have a niche. I don't really stick to one thing, and some people are like, why don't you make multiple channels? And I'm like, because I can barely get 1,000 subscribers on this one channel, I'm not ready for multiple channels. I think that this channel itself is just kind of just a mixed bag. I've done reactions, I've done gameplay. This is just everything that I enjoy, and that's exactly what this channel is about. So without further ado, let's get into the actual video. So, Red, I'm going to call her Rachel from now on. Rachel is probably one of the most important characters in the Percy Jackson series. And at first glance, you might be like, no, she's not. She's like a minor character in the series. She has no significance. She's just an annoying little brat. But let's take a step back for a moment, because I think that Rachel gets a lot of hate for being the girl that is supposedly kind of hindering Percabeth from happening. She's the girl that is stopping Percy and Annabeth from realizing their true feelings. But I actually think that there is more to Rachel than what is given. So for those of you who don't know who Rachel is introduced to us in the Titan's Curse. She actually is encountered by a random happenstance when they go into the Hoover Dam. And the Percy, who is lingering behind and kind of following Zoe and them, runs into Rachel. And at first it seems just like a random encounter with a mortal. But the thing that sets Rachel apart from any other mortal other than Percy's mother is that she knows that Percy is holding a sword. Now this is a big deal because in the books, at least, the mist is something that prohibits a mortal from realizing the truth about the Greek world. It is done to basically, explain why people aren't freaking out about this. And to some degree, demigods also are a victim of the mist. They are vulnerable to the mist. That's why they don't necessarily realize that they are demigods until a much older age. And even then, it's sometimes hard to distinguish what is real and what is just the mist. Kind of manipulating the situation. And no, it is not spray on, so fuck that up. Sorry. Anyway, okay. Getting off track. Sorry. The mist is a big deal. And it was established as a big deal from the very first book. And so it's shocking when we see this random girl appear and she sees Percy holding a sword. Ordinarily, she would just see a pen, but because she is special, she seizes the sword. Now, at first glance, you might see, oh, that was just a one-off encounter, and it seemed like that at the beginning. But then, in Battle of the Labyrinth, Rachel attends Percy's high school. It turns out that Rachel actually lives pretty close to where Percy does, and they go to school together. Rachel, being Rachel, kind of like, I was like, hey, you're the kid with that sword. And like, Percy's like, there's that whole encounter in the Battle of the Labyrinth. And she also kind of accidentally makes Annabeth jealous because Annabeth thinks that they're going on a movie date. And then suddenly there's this random girl who knows about the Greek world. that she doesn't know, and she's not a demigod, and so suddenly Annabeth is kind of like taken aback. And then as this is developing, right, Percy starts this relationship kind of with Rachel, although not really a real relationship. But because Rachel is so connected to this world, it turns out that they actually need her in order to go through the labyrinth, because she is a mortal who can see through the mist. So she can see beyond what some demigods can. So she is the one who can guide them. And that, number one, annoys Annabeth, because here's this random girl who she doesn't know getting in the way of her of her future boyfriend. And at first, it feels like Rachel is just this annoying character. And then in The Last Olympian, there are a few things. Number one, Rachel is kind of one of the reasons why Percy and the gang end up actually winning. And then, also on top of that, she becomes the Oracle. The Oracle of Delphi. She becomes the person who can distribute quests. The person who can give prophecies. And this is even more important, as it sets up the heroes of Olympus. So that's kind of like the general synopsis of who Rachel is. But why is she actually more important than you might think? Why is she not just the annoying girl that everyone thinks she is? Well, I would argue that Rachel is Percy's anchor to the mortal world. She is the one who reminds Percy of reality. She gives genuine advice on what a mortal would think of this world. She has no connection to the Greek world, and yet she can see everything. And that is a very important aspect. She also, kind of does a lot for Percy. She is the only one, other than his mom, who knows about Percy's life without being a real part of it. Right? No one else outside of the school, not even Paul at the time, not even Percy's stepdad, knows about this whole world that Percy is in. And while his mom does know, she's not really a good person to see what the mortal world thinks of this whole thing, because she's been a part of it, because she literally, had a child with a god, and so obviously she knows a lot about what it's like to be in that world, even if she has no part in it. But Rachel is just some random girl who gets thrown in here her father. So what's interesting is that, the demigods, they always have parent issues because the gods have some laws and whatever. But Rachel also has parent issues, but isn't part of the demigod world. She's just a random girl, which means that her struggles with parenthood, with her parents, comes from the willingness to kind of ignore their daughter rather than blaming it on a law. There's no law prohibiting her father from, paying a little bit more attention to his daughter. And yet, we have the exact same situation as most of the demigods are going through. So there's also that. And then further, Rachel is really the only, real perspective of the mortal gaze. You could argue that maybe Percy, he grew up in the world, but as he gets closer and closer and more deeper into the Greek world, he kind of loses that foresight of what it's like to be mortal. He doesn't really understand what it's like to be outside of the Greek world, and Annabeth sure as hell doesn't. She literally grew up in the camp, Camp Half-Blood, where there was this literal bubble around her where she couldn't leave and see what the world was like. And even Sally, she has some realness to her, but she also was the one who, was in love with a god. But Rachel is just this random person who happens to be a part of this world too. And so she really represents how people would react if they were put in this situation. She is the one that gives us kind of a glimpse of ourselves in this world. And it's interesting because it's kind of ironic in a way that as human as Percy is, and as human as any of the demigods are, or any of the gods are, well, gods aren't human, they can only relate to so much about the real world because they don't really know what it's like to live in the real world because they're so caught up in their little bubble. Meanwhile, Rachel is there to kind of bring that sense of reality back into the books. It's just so interesting that there was even the decision to include a mortal in this series, other than Sally. Rachel plays a more of an important role than I think we give her credit. She also actually helps Percy realize his feelings for Annabeth. Now, this might seem backwards, because at first it seems that Rachel is there to just make Annabeth jealous, and, she's just is the annoying stump in the wall. I don't know. What did I just say? I don't know what I just said. But what I do know is that Annabeth is a very stubborn person. I don't think that really needed to be said, but she is. She's a stubborn girl who doesn't want to acknowledge she doesn't really, I think she doesn't really understand that Percy doesn't understand what his feelings are. I mean, because Annabeth, with all of her knowledge, kind of has this wall that prohibits her from really relating to anyone that is outside of camp. Remember that Annabeth grew up in camp. She truly did. Which means she really grew up in this bubble. And so there's a lot about human beings and just people that Annabeth doesn't really know. I mean, she starts to go out into the real world, right? She starts to understand a little bit. But there's still kind of that lack of being able to empathize with Percy. And Rachel can, because Rachel does understand. And Rachel sees this kind of connection. And it is kind of funny, though, when Rachel dumps Percy, even though they didn't really date. But it also forces Percy to realize his feelings for Annabeth because of this, because of all of this. He's like, well, I don't know what really happened, but okay. That's kind of what Percy does. And then it leads into the whole, scene with Annabeth and Percy, where they finally lead up to their moment where they finally admit to each other their actual feelings for each other. And while I too did hate Rachel for a moment, I can see why Rachel was necessary for Percy. And, I think Percy would have realized over time at some point, but I think it's because, Rachel kind of reminded Percy of something, she helped remind Percy that it's not all about just being a hero or winning a war. That's important, of course, but what's also important is his ground in humanity. And I also think that there is, in some ways, leads to the reason why Percy kind of rejects godhood. It's not that, it's obviously the fact that he would not be able to be with Annabeth is a contributing factor. But also, I think it's also because, he just doesn't want to be a god. And the reason for that is because I think he sees kind of the goodness of what it's like to just be another guy. And Rachel treats Percy just like any other guy, because she doesn't really know who Percy is. She never really grew up with Percy. She barely knows Percy at all. And yet, I think Rachel helps Percy more than we like to acknowledge. Rachel is also a bit of a wild card. Rachel is completely unexpected. I don't know about you, but when Percy randomly runs into this random girl and she notices, oh, cool. I didn't think that was going to go anywhere. I mean, it certainly sets up this question of, well, do other mortals see that Percy is wielding a sword? And what happens if they do? And how many people can see through the mist? Are there people that just don't say anything? Because it definitely presents a lot of questions when suddenly mortals can see into the world. And while Sally is clearly someone who knows a lot of the Greek world, it's not really seen as a surprise necessarily when she can see, because I believe that Sally is only partially she's only able to see a little bit into the mist, which is realistic, I think, for someone who had a relationship with a god. But as someone who can see fully through the mist, there is no mist for Rachel, it definitely leaves a lot of questions to be kind of asked. Okay, well, how much could she see? Can she see everything? And there's just a lot of setup. And I think also because Annabeth, and no one knows who this girl is. Nobody does. Not even Percy. And she just randomly appears. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating, is that everyone else Percy met through his childhood, he grew up with them, he met them in camp. But Rachel happened on a random quest that he wasn't even supposed to be on. Can you imagine that? Rachel wasn't even supposed to encounter Percy because Percy wasn't even supposed to be on the quest. He just decided to follow the others. And that makes it even more curious because, again, there's another instance where Rachel kind of helps Annabeth and Percy realize their feelings for each other. And I think for a while, I mean, Annabeth clearly knew more than Percy did. I mean, come on, she knows that they're going on a movie date and dresses up for it. But at the same time, it kind of forced Annabeth to actually make a move on Percy. Because she didn't want another Rachel to sweep him off his feet. And so, Rachel makes Annabeth conflicted. Like, what the hell? This is my guy, but my guy doesn't even know that he's my guy. And it's like, for everything that Rachel does, Rachel also represents kind of like the trickster in the story. Like, she kind of just changes everything that we know about the world. And it happens right in the middle of the series too, which is the best part, to put her in there. It's just all so fascinating. It's all so fascinating. And then Rachel also just represents the audience. Rachel is the audience. Rachel is us looking into this world, not able to be in this world, but we're able to see this world. And Rachel is exactly that. Rachel, as much as we might not want to admit it, is us. And I think that's really the most important part of this series. Rachel is literally us. We right now are mortals who can see into the Greek and Roman world. And yet we can't do anything, but Rachel is the only one who can do something. Rachel changes this whole thing up. And that's actually really interesting. The fact that Rachel is just us. Rachel is the reader. Rachel sees that, hey, Percy, you're not the hero. You're not the hero that you think you are. And it's just so interesting. And then also, Rachel shows us that an ordinary human, we, are capable of saving the world. Because that's exactly what Rachel did. As small as her actions were, she did a very important thing. A dumb thing, but a very important thing. She told Percy the truth. And that truth led to Percy making the right decision to save the world. Rachel is the reason why Percy decides to hand Luke the dagger. Because Rachel told him, hey, Percy, you're not the hero. And at first Percy was like, what the hell? I thought I was the hero. But then Percy realizes the truth. It's not him, it's Luke. Luke has to make the decision to sacrifice himself for the world. And Percy has to make the decision to trust that Luke will make the right decision. Meanwhile, Annabeth, as smart as she is so lost because she's grieving. Because she lost literally her best friend. And, Annabeth is very capable. Don't get me wrong. I love Annabeth too. But Annabeth isn't perfect. And Annabeth's judgment is clouded. And Annabeth probably wouldn't have necessarily given Luke the dagger. She wouldn't have thought of that. I mean, Luke does say that he has to be the one to do it, and Annabeth kind of encourages him to give it. But Rachel is really the one that truly sways Percy's decision, which is interesting. And then I forget, do I have? Okay. Well, that is all I have to say about Rachel, I think. And I do think that Rachel is actually more important than we give her credit. I think she does deserve a lot more respect in the series. Because at the end of the day, I mean, let's be honest, Rachel is just us. That's exactly what Rachel is. And I'd be happy to hear what you guys think of Rachel down in the comments. Leave a like on this video, and don't forget to subscribe for more like this. See you guys next time. Bye.